So we're going to do the next class on the book of Genesis, trying to look at the theology of Genesis. There's been a great resurgence in the study of the book of Genesis, mainly driven by two factors from what I can see in the literature and from what I observe on social media. Is one, the challenge to Genesis with regard to God, and the second one, whether God exists, and the other one is how God, if he did exist, how did he create the world? Now, we dealt with the two aspects of how Christians look at how God would have created the world last week. But today we're going to look a little bit more detail about the first chapter of Genesis, and particularly the first and second verses. So I'm going to just read the first Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, verse 2 says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So this word Bereshit is the Hebrew word for beginning, and that's how the Bible begins. It says the beginning. So we will see that as far as the Bible is concerned, the beginning is considered from the time that God created the world. It does not deal with God's existence prior to that. It does not deal with the dimension in which he lives, and so on and so forth. So we will look at that today. So what can we take from this first verse, this very simple verse? We can take a few theological, or when we use the word theological, it's not an academic point. It's something that we need to internalize for ourselves. What can we believe from Genesis 1:1, for example? So the first point is that there is a creator. Right off the bat, it says, in the beginning, God created. So while it does not give us any information about what happened before, we know at the beginning of matter, time, and space, there is a creator, and that creator is God. And so here it talks about the creator creation, and therefore it posits a meaning to existence. That means if we have a creator, then there must be a reason why the creator has created us. For example, if we take a simple thing in our life, any invention or creation of a new appliance or a new vehicle, there is a reason for its existence. So if we take, for example, a simple pen, the pen exists for us to write. That's the meaning of the existence of the pen. And the creator of the pen created it to write on a piece of paper. Now, we could, of course, not worry about who created the pen and just use it as we see fit. But if we misuse the pen for something that it is not made to do, for example, if we took the pen and stirred a cup of coffee with the pen, the coffee would still be stirred, but it would probably ruin the pen. So the creation now is ruined because it was used for what it was not meant to do. So the creator has created us in the beginning, the heavens and the earth, and therefore there is a meaning to existence, and there is a meaning to why we exist as human beings. And therefore that meaning is posited in the reason why we are created. If we kind of stray from that, then you find that all kinds of problems can occur, as we see in the world, as man has rejected the creator and made himself the arbiter of all things that they do. So man decides what is right, what is wrong, and we see society having difficulties. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that when we reject the creator, there are two aspects we can see in life, right? The first one would be the secular naturalism or humanism, as we call it, where generally society is atheistic or agnostic. They kind of don't acknowledge that there's a God. And if you do that, then how has everything come into existence? They basically say that it's all by chance, therefore God does not exist, and there is no meaning to existence. And when there's no meaning to existence, you create your own meaning. Problem becomes that over time, we have difficulty trying to decide why we are even alive, and that brings a lot of anxiety and other issues into the human system. And we find that happening now, compared to 40 years ago when I first started off in medicine, compared to now, mental health issues have taken the more than 50% of the time of a family doctor, for example. Whereas 40 years ago, it was all pain, right? Management of arthritic pain or pain from injuries. And so painkillers were the #1 prescribed medication 40 years ago. Now it is antidepressants, anti-anxieties. Then, of course, the other group is pantheism. So there's a whole other group. This would be maybe the group that would be spiritual, but not religious. Basically, the underlying worldview is Baalism, or in the modern iteration, all aspects of Hinduism, Hindu light, New Age, that sort of thing, where the world is part of God, and so we are all divine, but all our problems are because we don't realize we are divine, so we can't ascertain the meaning of life, and so we are basically ignorant, and that's why all these problems we're having in life. And there's a good number of people, and originally this was more of a Hindu kind of philosophy, New Age philosophy, that the world is an illusion. We are kind of just actors on a stage where nothing is real, right? And New Age philosophy was positing this kind of theology. But what happened was, over the years now, when scientists like those who do physics particularly, have accepted this kind of worldview, you find that then they interpret data according to this worldview. And so you find things like quantum physics and string theory coming into existence, and talking about multiverse and numerous universes and all that sort of thing. So you find that when there is this dichotomy, people reject a creator, then we can create anything we want. And we have all kinds of explanations for why we are alive. So in the beginning, God created. Now, the second thing that we can look at or take from this is that nothing pre-existed before the creation of the world, in the sense that God created the heavens and the earth. So it still doesn't tell us the dimension in which God exists, the physics or the chemistry or how the dimension in which God exists. But when he created the heaven and the earth, the implication from the word bara. Now, that's the second word in Hebrew, right? In the beginning, God created. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elohim. So the bara comes before God. And this word bara, which is created or to make, implies that nothing existed before. And in the Torah, that is the Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament, bara is only used of God. And because only God can bara something out of nothing, right? Human beings, we can still make things. We can still create new things. We can discover new things, but we can only make things from what is already existing. That means what God had already made. So I think we all know that this word ex nihilo, God created us ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. That's the Latin term. So the next thing that we can draw out of this verse is that everything has a beginning except for God, right? Prior to God creating heavens and earth, there was nothing. And this includes linear time. So when we talk about matter, space and time, time also was created at that point. And so time is linear, basically. And for a long time, this was understood that time was linear, but that the dimension in which God exists does not have linear time. So when we talk about living forever with the Lord, or we will live eternally, many people say, oh, okay, then we're going to live millions, billions of years. Well, we are not going to live in linear time. We're going to live in a dimension where time, as we know it, linear time, does not exist. It's a different dimension of existence. But linear time is well known, and Einstein's theory of relativity, in fact, predicated that. And when Einstein created this theory of relativity and talked about time, and talked about matter and time and the relationship between matter and time, this led to scientists going all the way back to the singularity. If we were to talk about linear time, then the world started at some point, even using just physics. We would go back to a singularity of time, where time first began. And that's how, this various concepts of the Big Bang came out. Now what's happening is the modern quantum physics and string theory is trying to explain the universe without God. Because if you went back to the Big Bang and the singularity of the Big Bang, then the Christian can say, well, God may be created with the Big Bang. That's the first cause. So now what quantum physics and string theory is trying to do is to explain that even time as we understand it is not linear, and therefore is circular, we call it. Now, if you have any knowledge of Hindu philosophy, their knowledge of time is circular. That means you go round and round in a circular manner. And so as I read simplified versions of quantum physics and simplified versions of string theory, I realize that they've come from that mindset. Just like the Christian scientists like Newton, they came from a Christian mindset and they worked on linear time. Those who come from a mindset of circular time then would interpret physics in this manner. It's all trying to remove God from the equation. That's the problem. Now, the other thing is that when the Hebrew Bible came out and when this Old Testament Torah came out, it was radical because society at that time was pantheistic and was polytheistic, lots and lots of gods. But when the Torah said, in the beginning, God created, right? One God created, and there was only one God to which we would answer, monotheism brought about a moral and intellectual basis for the meaning and purpose of life. So we talked about the meaning and purpose in the beginning, but meaning and purpose really can be focused if we have one God in whom morality is grounded, and all the attributes of morality are in this one God who has created us. If we have multiple gods, then we would be able to locate morality in different gods who have different characteristics. And again, you can go to either the Greek pantheon or the Roman pantheon of gods, or the Celtics, or even the Hindu gods. All of them go back to Baalism, right? And if you read the Bible, you'll see that there are various names for Baal. And these, the various names for Baal are the various names of the gods. So the Hebrew Bible was radical in that sense. It brought monotheism into the picture, and we now are grounded in a universal morality that comes from the one God. And this is a basic law that is written into the conscience of man. As we will see if we read, for example, Romans 1. And I mentioned earlier, the next one that we can see is that Bible gives no indication of the origin of God because he existed before what we call linear time. Now, there are, as we have mentioned, these pantheistic religions and polytheistic religions which go on a circular basis, but a lot of them also have stories of the birth of the world. or the creation of the world. So you will find that the Babylonians had some kind of creation story. The Hindus have a creation story. Like, for example, there was this primordial lake on which there was a lotus flower from which, man was created. And then there was a primordial man where the head became something, the foot became something. I don't want to go into all that because it's really not necessary for us to know all this. Just to know that as far as the Bible is concerned, it doesn't tell us. Just tells us in the beginning, God created matter, space, and time. God created the heavens and the earth. What does that imply? When we look at nature today and we look around, we see that that nature is beautiful, nature is good. People have a great appreciation for nature, and you'll see now with this trend towards climate change and all these things, people are worried about something going to happen to nature. But from the Christian point of view, when we read in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we read the rest of Genesis 1, we realize that God created nature. All that we see around us is created by God, and he is separate from God. So what we are seeing is the creator, creation. And of course, we can see that in nature, the handiwork of God. And this is what some people call the book of nature. And some people elevate the book of nature to the scripture, right? They say we can take the same kind of lessons from both. But if we look at God as the creator of nature, then book of nature is subordinate to the scriptures that we have. Now, the worship of nature usually flows from a rejection of the idea of God or a separate creator. So if we are not able to accept that God created the nature and we just look at this nature and the nature becomes our God, then worship follows. Because, human beings are like that, right? When they appreciate something, when they begin to love it a lot, the next thing is to give it importance. And the next thing is to give it a place of where the passions go. And from there, it is a short step to worshiping whatever we have a passion and whatever we love to do or to see or to enjoy. So we carry on. We are going to ask this question: who created God? And there are two questions I want to ask actually. This is the first one. The reason we're asking this is because this is something that we will be asked all the time, and it's a question of apologetics. And we have to be clear in our own minds about this question. Otherwise, we will be rocked whenever an article comes out in the paper or in the magazines, or if our children go to school and they are challenged. And it's always this question, well, who created God? What's what they call first cause? So if you can remember what I mentioned earlier, when scientists were still thinking in terms of linear time, and they looked at Einstein's theory of relativity, and they extended that all the way back to time starting with a singularity. So they looked at the Big Bang. So you realize that the Big Bang theory had been around forever among secular humanists. They could not explain who created the Big Bang, just that there was a Big Bang. And they said that's the first cause. So Christians could counter and say, well, God created the Big Bang as the first cause. And then we can go back and say, well, then who created God? So it becomes a question of ad infinitum. We cannot, we just keep going back and say, okay, then who created, and we go back. And so if you look at this verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. The Bible actually does not deal with this question. So trying to explain it from our own perspective or our own intellectual understanding is really almost meaningless. It's a meaningless discussion for us, because trying to discuss a first cause can lead to infinite discussions of who then created the first cause, right? He existed, he created, and he has no origin. So for us, our God is the first cause. When we read this verse, we say, in the beginning, God created. Our God is the first cause. who always was and always will be. And if you go all the way to Revelation, you will see that this is what the angels and those around the throne were singing, right? Who was and is to come. That means he was, he is, and he is to come, right? So, and as I mentioned, the Big Bang posits a beginning for the universe, and they have now a difficulty with this, right? So those of you who are baby boomers like me, you probably heard all the time, Big Bang, Big Bang, Big Bang. But remember the millennials, our children, and now the Gen Z, I think it is, the ones who are born in 94 and onwards, they don't really talk about the Big Bang. They're now talking about multiverse, because the atheists have a difficulty with the Big Bang. They don't want to go back to a singularity and a single cause for the universe. And so the multiverse theory is now becoming the statement of faith for the atheist. So it might be helpful for us, if you have time, just to go and look at a very simplified explanation of what multiverse theory is. It comes from quantum physics. It comes from string theory. I was on a Hindu website trying to see how they are thinking about this multiverse theory and how they are thinking about quantum physics. And they are very happy, actually. They're saying quantum physics proves that Hinduism was true all the time, because there is no creator. It all just exists, and the particles can move in any number of directions, and so on and so forth. And now we have no time to deal with multiverse theory, and I don't think it's necessary for us in a class like this to do that in great detail. It's for those who are interested to know what your children may be thinking and how they are thinking and how they are being taught in schools. So for us, we have some arguments for God's existence, right? We believe that in the beginning God created. So it's a given for us. We take it by faith that God created us. And so when somebody asks us an apologetics question, they say, okay, why is there anything in this world? When we look at the nature, we can tell them, well, science and atheism really cannot answer this question, why things are here, right? Science can only explain what is. This is called observational science. So if I look at something, I can say, okay, it's there. I'm now looking right now at my Bible. So my Bible is right here. I can explain that it exists. I can explain that it was made at a printer. I can explain that the words were printed with some ink. The paper was made from wood pulp, whatever. I can explain that. But beyond that, I cannot explain where wood came from, or how the world came, into being, or why something came out of nothing. And when science tries to go into the realm of trying to explain why something exists, that's called historical science. That means where people make postulations. Unfortunately, today, when science makes historical postulations, people take it as truth because they confuse observational science with historical science. Now, we cannot prove God exists by science, and we have to accept that, because trying to explain God's existence by science is an impossible task. Science cannot explain that there is no God, and science cannot explain that there is God, because God is beyond nature. He is outside nature. In the beginning, God, he just existed. But science can prove what is within nature. So we can look at electricity, for example. I was watching how Nikola Tesla, discovered alternating current yesterday compared to Edison, who discovered the light bulb and was talking about direct current. And then I was looking at that and thinking, yeah, we can find all these. They were already there. Tesla and Newton and Edison, they just found what was there. They can only prove what is within nature, but they cannot prove God's existence by that. But from a Christian point of view, a creator is the only rational explanation for our existence, because a creator is the only thing that can explain why something can exist. Now, for the longest time, there was something called the Watchmaker Analogy used by Christians, because they said that if you have a watch, it had to be made by somebody, because any other explanation that the watch came out of nothing or always existed are less plausible, because it's posited on chance or random processes. So other people have used this analogy. They said, okay, throw in all the chemicals and elements and all this thing together, give it billions of years, and you get a 747 jumbo jet. You know, that's almost impossible, that somebody had to create it. And of course, the most important thing is science cannot explain the emergence of life, like how you can get an animate, sentient being from inanimate chemicals. So from our point of view, I think that's the only rational explanation for existence. If we reject God, then we have to find other explanations. And, you know, if you'll find that people insist on that. So the watchmaker analogy or the watchmaker argument is a teleological argument. Okay, that means it's trying to explain the end goal, which states that by way of an analogy, that a design implies a designer, especially intelligent design by an intelligent designer. Okay, so usually the watchmaker analogy has been used for over 50 years to say that, well, there is a creator deity, right? So this could apply in general about a broad discussion about intelligent design. Now, Richard Dawkins tried to address this. You know, Richard Dawkins is a practical, very is practically a very anti-Christian sort of person, he tried to say that, well, the complex process of Darwinian natural selection is unconscious and automatic. If natural selection can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is a blind one, working without foresight or purpose. So what he's saying is, okay, you can still create a watch. You can still create it without foresight or purpose. And the process is unconscious and automatic if we use Darwinian natural selection. Now, this was Dawkins' answer to the watchmaker analogy. If you can see here, to me, it doesn't make sense. But, you know, a lot of people said, oh, okay, Dawkins makes sense that you can have a blind watchmaker who, you know, just kind of started putting things together without knowing what he was doing, and a watch turned up. Now, there was another argument used by John Wisdom, and actually it was popularized by Anthony Flew in 1952. And I'm mentioning this just to show you how people think, right, outside Christian faith, because we get sermons all the time. We know how we think, but sometimes it's good to know how people outside our church bubble thinks. And Anthony Flew he worked on this invisible gardener idea in 1952 because he was probably the most celebrated atheist at the time. And he used this to illustrate the differences between assertions based on faith and assertions based on scientific evidence, and the problems associated with unfalsifiable beliefs. It's interesting that he used it against God, but it could very well have been used against the false beliefs of the person who says that there is no God. So let's look at what Flew said. His main claim in using the parable is that religious believers, that means you and I, do not allow anybody to falsify their assertions. So we assert that God created the world, as we saw in Genesis 1. He created the heavens and the earth. And if we read the rest of Genesis, he created it in 6 days. But he says that, oh, when you challenge them on this and you say, okay, science is showing this, science is showing that, there's evolution, there's long age of earth and all this stuff, Flew then says, instead, they now change their beliefs to suit the questioner. So you see how if Christians don't stick to the word of God and to probably the plain reading of the word of God, this is how outside people view us. They say that we just falsify what we are saying by changing our beliefs to suit the questioner. And so Flew concludes that religious believers cause God to die the death of 1,000 qualifications. Do you see that happening in church today? you see that the secular culture is bombarding us with all this, ideas about sexuality, about gender dysphoria. But it all started with doubting whether God exists and whether God created in 6 days, or whether God created through evolution, or whether evolution is true, or whether the world is old. But it all started from there. And slowly, what Flew said, religious believers are starting to cause God to die the death of 1,000 qualifications. I find that with preachers as well. And I have that problem as well sometimes. I find I come and preach a passage that's a little uncomfortable, and then I qualify it before I actually preach that passage, and to avoid antagonizing people. But sometimes we just have to preach what the Word of God says, and leave it at that. Now, it's interesting that Anthony Flew did that in 1952, but about 50 years later, he himself realized that there had to be somebody who created the garden. So this invisible garden, this is what he said. There are 2 explorers coming upon a jungle where there's a garden where there are flowers, and one explorer says some gardener must be tending this plot. The other says there is no gardener, right? So they set up a barbed wire fence, and they're trying to look for this gardener, but nothing ever happens. God, we can't see God. We can't see God working in nature through our 5 senses. We can't see God. We can just see him through faith, through how he works in our lives, but we can't actually see him. So what the unbeliever says is that the believer is never convinced, even if you show that you can't see God. So at last, the skeptic says, what remains of your original assertion? Just how do you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener? And how does that differ from an imaginary gardener or no gardener at all? So that was the argument that Flew made. But 50 years later, he realized that argument was flawed. And he said that the amazing design of nature really showed that there is God. So when Anthony Flew became what is called a theist, that means he now believed that there was a creator. He didn't become a Christian, but he said that there was a creator. The atheist society actually got very upset with him, and wrote a lot of articles against him and said Anthony Flew is, deluded and etc. in his old age. Now, the next thing, of course, is that science cannot explain consciousness. We are self-aware compared to, animals. And so we got to ask ourselves, how did self-awareness come out of non-awareness? And this is really the image of God in us. We will deal with that in a future class about in Genesis, as we read, God breathed into us life, yes. Problem of suffering, this is another one. The main difficulty for people who deny God is suffering. And I'm going to deal with this next week because it is more, I think we need to think about this in more detail. So next week, we will deal with the problem of suffering. So today, we have mainly dealt with the creator-creation dichotomy. We have dealt with God's revealed word as compared to the book of nature, and that one should subserve the other. We have also dealt with arguments of science, which are trying to change this idea of linear time, which God created. God created matter, space, and time in a linear fashion by positing this multiverse theory, that there are all these multiverses out there and universes out there. And we have shown that these do not comport with Genesis, the book of Genesis, and what God says in Genesis 1:1. So next time we will go into this problem of suffering, which is probably the main difficulty for people who deny God. The people who deny God, a lot of them, and even those Christians or those who professed the Christian faith, who have left the faith, say that suffering is one of the reasons they denied God and left the faith. We will deal with that next week.